In autumn 1943, Kiev remained occupied by the Nazis. However, the gun roar which foretold the approaching liberation of the Ukrainian capital could be heard to the east. Retreating, the Nazis fought back fiercely. In the meantime, the liberators were facing another tough trial, the crossing of the wide and mighty Dnieper. To help the troops which were to liberate Kiev, the military leaders prepared an airborne operation, and the paratroopers trained successfully, without knowing anything about where they would be sent. Petri Nezhevenko, Isai Stratievsky, Grigory Chukrai, and others in the airborne forces of the Liberators series. In late July 1930, the senior officers of the Air Force of Moscow Defense Command gathered to observe pilots Minov and Moshkovsky parachute from an aeroplane at an aerodrome near Voronezh. Those were not the first parachute jumps in the country, but no volunteers except Minov and Moshkovsky had been found. The majority of pilots were skeptical about the idea. A normal person will not abandon a fit plane for a piece of cloth. However, in a week, having trained parachuters, a detachment of 12 persons with weapons strapped on parachutes and were ready to fight. That was how an absolutely new airborne infantry, amazing for that time, was born. Trained persons were required to make it a new service arm. Hardly had 6 months passed when the young communist leader Komsomol took the air fleet of our country under patronage. Parachuting became a mass sport, a favorite pastime of the young. 20-meter towers popped up in urban parks. A parachute with a counterbalance ensuring a smooth landing, even from that insignificant height, was attached to them. Anyone could jump with such a parachute. An adult ticket cost 10 to 15 kopecks. School children jumped free of charge. Simultaneously, flying clubs and parachute hobby groups began to appear. The young who dreamt about aviation at this period made for them. Admittance to flying clubs was limited, while it was easier to get into a parachute hobby club. The Soviet Union became the home country of the airborne forces. The first paraborne detachment in the world's history was created by the Leningrad Defense Department. As early as in 1931, it was a military element of 480 parachuters, with 18 aircraft ready to fight. Isai Stratievsky recollects, "Select people, the pride of the nation, strong and competent men, patriots of the Soviet motherland, were gathered in the brigade." 2 years later, 4 special airborne brigades were organized. In 1935, when the advanced armies of the globe were making their modest attempts to include parachuters into the armed forces, the Soviet Union involved a landing force of 1,200 soldiers during maneuvers near Kiev. The foreign military attachés invited to the maneuvers were startled. German Colonel Kurt Student was particularly serious about what he saw. His report resulted in the 1st Parachuter Regiment under General Göring in Germany. In the USSR, the airborne forces developed, gained momentum, and grew in numbers. Prior to the war, the country had 5 airborne corps, 50,000 troopers strong. By the beginning of the war, 5 more corps were swung in the rear. However, the defeats of the first months of the war and loss of a great number of aircraft made the military leaders use the troopers as regular infantry and not in the enemy's rear. The 2 times hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant General Alexander Rodimtsev, the commanding officer of an airborne brigade in 1941, recollected the words of Chief of Staff of the Southwestern Front, General Perkayev. "In the situation like the one we're facing now, Comrade Rodimtsev, it is quite easy to get into the enemy's rear without any jumps. Some of our units and even the whole forces have already been enveloped, and you're going to jump." In late July 1941, when the German troops battled through to Kiev and occupied the aerodrome at the settlement of Giuliani, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwestern Front, General Kirponos committed the 3rd Airborne Corps to action. The 6th Airborne Brigade under the command of Colonel Viktor Zholudev entered the battle first. On August 6th, the brigade attacked the Nazis' positions. As a result of a desperate attack which turned into a hand-to-hand combat, the aerodrome and the settlement were liberated. The following day, Colonel Ivan Zatovatkin's 212th Airborne Brigade and Colonel Alexander Rotemtsev's 5th Brigade entered the battle near Kiev. On August 8th, the Nazis attempted to assault the aerodrome. The troopers defeated at least 10 attacks of the enemy going hand-to-hand on numerous occasions. On August 9th, the battle became even fiercer. In the morning, the positions of the Soviet troopers were hit by intense artillery fire and bombings from the air. The Nazis attacked. Only at the cost of huge casualties, they managed to take back the Giuliani Aerodrome in 4 days. A couple of days later, at the dawn of August 13th, the 3rd Airborne Corps assumed the offensive. 3 brigades attacked the enemy simultaneously, brushing them aside from Kiev by over 15 kilometers. Without the support of heavy firepower equipment, the whole service arm was under the threat of loss. Having understood that, the Soviet military leaders removed all the airborne units from the fronts to the reserve of the general headquarters by August 1941. In the beginning of 1942, the Vyazma landing operation, the longest one of its kind, was carried out. From January 27th through February 2nd, around 2,000 persons landed in the Nazis' rear in the area of Vyazma. The following raid of 7,000 persons took place on the night of February 23rd. The troopers were to attack from the Nazis' rear to capture the Vyazma-Kirov Railway and the English of Vyazma, Dorogobuj, and Yuknov. At least 5 infantry regiments of the enemy, having entrenched positions and artillery and air support, countervailed them. Carrying out the task that had been set before them, the Soviet troopers advanced by 20 to 22 kilometers in some directions. The main forces of the Soviet troops were to advance toward the troopers from the front line, but they did not manage to press the advance, and the troopers in the enemy's rear had to take on the defense. 3,000 troopers remaining alive fought from March through the end of April. In May, they began to battle through their troops, but they managed to do that by June 28th only. The Vyazma operation did not succeed. However, it ensured successful actions of the troops, delivering a major thrust on the Nazis near Moscow. Unfortunately, the experience of the battles did not develop. Due to significant losses of aircraft in the first year of the war and other difficulties in ensuring landing operations, 10 airborne corps were transformed into Guards rifle divisions. However, in 1943 the situation changed. In late August, as a result of a number of attacks by the Red Army in the south and center, the Nazi defense collapsed, and the front rolled back to the west. The race to the Dnieper began. Troops from Smolensk to the Azov Sea began to move. The Red Army advanced with incredible tempo by the infantry standards. Thus, the troops of the steppe front covered 9 kilometers a day on average. The military leaders began to think about the upcoming crossing of the Dnieper, one of the largest rivers in the European part of the USSR, which widths in some areas reached 4 kilometers. There, the troopers were to play their role. New airborne brigades, which were to help the troops in the river crossing, were formed. The retreating enemy did everything possible to slow down the advance of the Soviet troops. At every city, town, village, high point, a small Nazi garrison was left. Retreating, the Nazis left burnt land to the liberators. All the infrastructure facilities, water towers, railways, and bridges were destroyed. The population was taken away to strip the Soviet troops of staples and replenishments for the army. Homes were burnt down. The 300 kilometers to the Dnieper were to be remembered by the soldiers and commanders of the Red Army during their whole life. Meanwhile, airborne brigades were formed in the rear. The training of a trooper began with parachuting. Novices studied the design of the parachute and the rules of its packing, trained using equipment simulators, familiarized with the parachute harness, mastered landing. In a week or two, practice jumps from a 40-meter tower or an aerostatic balloon, which the troopers called the sausage for its distinctive form. The aerostatic balloon would be raised to the height of 800 to 1,200 meters, and sometimes even lower for more troopers to jump. There were those who were afraid to jump from the aerostatic balloon. In such cases, the instructors pushed out the hesitant as a rule. Matvey Lichterman recollects, "The instructor would shout, 'Just don't jump, and I'll send you a penal unit.' And he would kick the soldier out from the door of the car with an abrupt movement. We jumped and landed, and immediately afterwards, we see the guy, safe and happy, approaching us and saying, 'That was great.'" Upon mastering the jumps from an aerostatic balloon, troopers began to master jumps from L-12 or TB-3 aircraft. They jumped day and night and without weapons. 25 troopers at a time could board an L-12 during practice jumps, and up to 50 persons could board a heavy bomber aircraft TB-3. During the flight, troopers sat on benches along the cabin boards. When the aeroplane entered the jump zone, a red light went off in the cabin. The white flag of the aircraft controller could also be the signal. Following the signal, troopers lined up along both sides of the cabin and fastened the spring hooks of their lanyards to a metal beam or a cable along the body of the aircraft under the ceiling. Then the door or bomb doors opened, and troopers jumped out one by one. Having jumped, they had to tuck in order not to spin. In a couple of minutes, a jerk followed. The lanyard fastened to the cable in the aircraft cabin pulled the parachute. A flap followed, and the parachute opened. Prior to landing, troopers had to turn their backs to the wind to land on their feet. In that case, the risk of a trauma was minimal. That was a successful jump. But sometimes it was different. The shroud lines could tangle, and sometimes it would not open at all. In that case, there was always a reserve parachute for practice jumps. But if the main parachute did not open completely for some reason, for example, because of tangled shroud lines, there was a risk that the reserve parachute would tangle with it and the parachuter would die. It was luck if the height permitted and there was time to cut the shroud line of the main parachute. To that end, troopers always had switchblades on their waist belts during jumps. While it was a weapon in the first place, it had neither a curve nor special notches on the blade, but it could be used to cut shroud lines. However, not everybody could save his life in an emergency situation. Fear underdeveloped skills or negligence while packing the parachute. Petri Nezhevenko recollects, "The parachute likes when you like it. You should pack it as required, then it is flawless." If a trooper has sufficient skills and does not panic, then in the majority of cases, he remained unhurt in dangerous situations. Semen Nikelshper recollects, "In our battalion, one soldier caught with a parachute on the aircraft wing, but he was wise enough to cut the lines of the main parachute and landed with the reserve one." It should be said that not everybody was brave enough to make the first jump from the plane. Those who refused were kicked out of the aircraft, and those who would not be pushed out or convinced to jump were most often sent to the infantry without any fuss. However, the instructors tried to help with their exits to overcome fear not only with kicks and threats, but also by their own example. Matvey Lichterman recollects. The instructors were extremely professional. To make us forget our fear, they constantly demonstrated some complicated, almost acrobatic jumps. Eventually, women doctors from the Brigade Medical Battalion would board the plane beside the would-be troopers and jump with bouquets of flowers in their hands, giving us a lead. You know the men's psychology. How come a woman jumps? What about me? Am I not fit? Women served in airborne units equally with men. As a rule, they were drivers, signalers, doctors, and nurses. But at the same time, each of them learned to jump with a parachute, shoot, and learned hand-to-hand combat fighting. Isai Stratievsky recollects. We were mostly trained for night action. Often, at night, we practiced simulating an assault of a Nazi aerodrome or carrying out various subversion acts far behind the lines. We had intensified training in hand-to-hand and bayonet fighting. The majority of troopers were trained as signalers. Blue field caps were not the only symbol of a service arm. The moral and psychological aim of troopers was just one: to complete the mission even at the cost of their own lives. Semen Nikelsper recollects. We were trained psychologically very well. Basically, any landing in the Nazi rear was inevitably associated with a heroic death in our perception, and we were proud and flaunted our readiness to sacrifice life for our country.
Зачастую десантники даже оставляли для своего последнего боя.
Often, troopers left hand grenades on their belts close to their hearts for their last fight. It was not an order of their commanders. It was the troopers who wished to blow themselves up in the critical moment and take a couple of enemy soldiers with them.
И прихватить с собой несколько вражеских солдат.
A carbine was the main standard weapon of the regular trooper. Officers were often armed with a PPS machine gun designed by Sudayev, especially for use by troopers, scouts, and when compact weapons were required. However, the PPS H-41 machine gun, which became one of the symbols of the Red Army, was considered to be more efficient for use in the enemy rear during a close-in fight. The Spagen machine gun pistol, PPS H-41, was a simple and reliable gun. Its production became possible without using highly qualified labor force and expensive equipment, which was most important in the initial period of the war. The PPS-H fired with handgun cartridges of 7.62 millimeter caliber. When firing, there was actually no recoil, and it was precise at the distances of 150 to 200 meters. Insignificant sight distance was compensated with the high rate of fire and a large cartridge drum, owing to which the PPS-H-41 was a perfect weapon for close-in fight. The Soviet soldiers felt the advantage of their weapons over the enemy's. Valentin Svetkov recollects. I used to fire a German machine gun, but it cannot be compared to our PPS-H. The PPS-H had 71 cartridges in the round drum, and the German one had 32. It is almost 1.5 times as few. The disc drum of the gun was difficult to produce, and filling it with cartridges took too much time. Due to this reason, during the second year of the war, the PPS-H's were supplied with 35 cartridge sector drums. The only obvious drawback of the PPS-H was its weight, which was too heavy for the weapons of this kind, over 5 kilos, with the disc drum. However, it was only critical for the scouts, who needed the lightest weapons to move quickly and without any noise. As a result, our scouts often used the German machine gun.
В действительности оба автомата
In reality, both guns, although their correct names are PPSH and MR machine guns, had the advantages of their own. They were designed on the basis of differing requirements to use in fight. It was the PPSH which turned out to be more appropriate for the Russian front in general. While designing the MR, the Germans staked on a compact weapon for parachuters and tankers. This resulted in a folding butt, as well as the comparatively high rate of firing for the economical consumption of cartridges. The PPSH had a drum of a larger capacity, a better butt, and a closer grouping of shots owing to an efficient canceller. The PPSH-41 rate of fire was twice as high as that of the MR-38. On the one hand, this resulted in less efficient consumption of ammunition. PPSH was even called a cartridge eater. But on the other hand, ensured a high density of fire, which was advantageous in close-in fighting. The German gun, due to its low rate of fire while firing in bursts, produced the relevant rattle so that it was called the belching rattle. At the same time, the low rate of fire appeared to be critical in the conditions of the Eastern Front. If dirt got inside the MR-40, the automatic devices refused to work. Moreover, the gun parts, matched with German precision, made it not really usable in the severe Russian frosts. The actual sight distance of the MR-38 MR-40 was shorter than that of the PPSH and did not exceed 100 to 150 meters. The major part was played by the use of the 7.62 cartridge, unlike the 9mm cartridge used in the German gun. The lower weight of the bullet meant its higher speed, flatter trajectory, less time to fly to the aim, and, respectively, higher probability of hitting. However, the fact that the German bullet was heavier also offered certain advantages. Its stop impulse was stronger, which partially nullified the advantages of the PPSH rate of fire. The Nazi troops, as well as ours, used the enemy's captured guns willingly. In the Wehrmacht, the captured PPSH were often remodeled for the German cartridges and drums of the MR-40. However, the Waffen-SS, the elite of the Nazi troops, preferred the PPSHs in the initial variant with the disc drum. It's not surprising that regular Soviet soldiers who were not involved in reconnaissance operations quite often preferred their guns and complained about the PPSH weight, only during long unmounted marches. By the end of September 1943, the Soviet troops reached the Dnieper in a broad front. The commanders decided to cross the river right away. There was a catastrophic lack of standard vessels, launches, barges, and boats to carry the troops. Soldiers made rafts and sometimes simply wrapped up sheaves of straw in all-weather raincoats and sewed with threads. Thus, a big pillow was made which kept afloat and did not let soldiers drown. There was a lack of boat bridges as well, so rafts were made to carry artillery and tanks across the river. On the night of September 22nd, the Soviet units began to cross the Dnieper. As soon as the majority of the vessels reached the center of the river, the Nazis delivered fire from the opposite bank. The water temperature in the Dnieper was around 15 degrees. Waves from shell bursts, like in a storm, overturned rafts and threw soldiers side to side, on their rucksacks stuffed with straw. Some died as a result of a direct hit. The screams of the wounded, the drowning, and the roar of the scarred horses who had fallen into the water could be heard everywhere. However, by morning, the Soviet troops captured beachheads on the right bank of the river. The beachhead captured near the town of Velikia Brukhin to the south from Kiev appeared to be most efficient for the Voronezh front. The direct way to the capital of the Ukraine opened from it. The beachhead was captured by the 4 detachments of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and the 40th Army, but the arrival of the main forces of the armies delayed. To keep and deepen the beachhead on the Dnieper bank, the military leaders decided to have troopers land in the enemy's rear. To that end, the 1st, 3rd, and 5th Guards Airborne Brigades, 10,000 persons strong, were provided in early September 1943. In the daytime of September 24th, The signal of air raid warning went off suddenly at the aerodrome of the town of Lebedin in Sumy region, where the Soviet troopers were stationed. Up in the air appeared the enemy bomber. It did not bomb, but dropped leaflets. "We're waiting for you. Come to us. We promise you a warm reception." Grigory Chukrai recollects, "Those leaflets would not confuse us. If they could really arrange a warm reception for us, we thought they would not have to warn us." In spite of its top secrecy, the Nazi scouts managed to find out about the operation being prepared. However, they did not know anything about either the place of the landing or the number of troopers. Near Sumy and Kharkiv, at the aerodromes of Lebedin, Shmorodin, and Bogodukiv, last-minute preparations for boarding planes were carried out. Petr Nevazhenko recollects, "At the aerodrome there were lots of weapons, ammunition, staples. Take what comes next to hand. Hardly did anybody take staples. Grenades and ammunition were taken mostly. It was warm. Great coats were left behind. The battle will last for 4 days at most, they say. Why does one need to carry a greatcoat?" While getting ready for the jump, the paratrooper would put on the outfit and weapons. He would attach an ammunition pouch, belt reserve ammunition pouch, switchblade in the sheath, flask, staples bag, cartridge pouch to the waist belt. After that, a gas mask was put on with a strap to the right shoulder, a parachute, a rifle, or a machine gun. Weapons were placed in a carrying case or wound with cloth. In the latter case, the case of weapons was to be wound especially carefully so that its prominent parts did not catch on the lines or parachute canopy when the parachute opened. The knife was especially important in the trooper's ammunition. It was used to cut the parachute lines while landing, as a silent weapon in close-in fighting. And it was an irreplaceable all-purpose tool in the day-to-day life of the trooper behind the front line. Various small-sized goods were thrown down in parachute soft bags. Reliable, hard but bulky airborne containers, which were widely used in foreign armies, did not strike root in the USSR. A reserve parachute was not taken. Instead of it, a rucksack in which there were 200 cartridges, an MRE pack with canned food, cigarettes, and even chewing gum, all-weather raincoat, flashlight. Pistol lights hang on his chest. The troopers were dressed in soldiers' blouses, boots, and sometimes shoes with leggings. The commanders and battalions and companies found out about the objectives and missions of their units as late as an hour and a half prior to boarding the plane. The reason for that was ensuring the top secrecy of troopers landing. In order not to put the enemy on the alert, the reconnaissance flights of our planes completely stopped 2 days prior to the troopers landing. It was even decided to inform the van units of our army, which had beachheads on the right bank of the Dnieper, only upon the brigade's consolidation in the enemy's rear. Exactly in those days, the situation at the Bend changed abruptly and became deadly dangerous for the troopers. Just 2 days prior to that, a field motorized and tank divisions had been concentrated in the area. Those divisions had sealed the beachhead. However, neither the air nor the agent reconnaissance found large reserves of the enemy in the landing area. The boarding was hectic, which caused a mess. In spite of the significant number of radio stations, they were distributed in such a manner that in some aircraft there were 5 to 6 of them, while none in others. Radio crews consisted of 2 persons, often appeared in different aircraft. Matvey Lichterman recollects, "My partner with an RBM radio set found himself in one plane, while I, with the batteries to the radio set, accumulator, and pad, were in another plane." At that moment, somebody remembered home, relatives, and close ones. Somebody dozed. Somebody else sat concentrating on the upcoming mission. Nobody tried to think about its immense danger. Transport planes were met with unexpectedly dense vertical fire. Planes shivered from close shell blasts. Carrying out the evasive maneuver, pilots threw their machines from side to side, ascending to leave the hitting area of at least the machine gun fire. The red lamp, an alert signal, went off. Troopers began to leave the plane. Grigory Chukrai recollects, Finding myself in the air, I did not understand a thing at first. There was fire beneath. Peasants' huts were set on fire. In the light of fires, the white canopies of parachutes were clearly seen against the dark sky. Tracer bullets were all around every one of us. A lot of our comrades died in the air. Under the enemy's fire, a lot of pilots had to drop troopers not where it had initially been planned. Besides, instead of previously agreed height of around 500 meters, the pilots dropped the troopers at the height of 1,000 to 2,000 meters. Matvey Lichterman recollects, tracer incendiary bullets went through parachutes, and the parachutes consisting of Capron and Momo flared up in no time. Dozens of burning torches appeared in the sky immediately. We saw everything. 2 disabled Douglases, from which soldiers did not manage to jump, sinking. Guys rained from the planes and fell down, having no chance to open their parachutes. It must be said that those who were lucky enough to reach the ground landed far from each other due to the significant dropping height. Petr Nezhavenko recollects, all the brigade had to land within the 7 to 10 kilometer radius, and the pilots dropped it in the radius of 100 kilometers, from Rzhishkiv to Cherkasy. Those who landed successfully tried to find their comrades as quickly as possible. The digit password of 25 was the signal. If one trooper shouts 15, the answer would be 10. The places of the troopers gathering were not agreed upon in advance. The commanders had to mark them immediately upon landing with pistol lights. The Nazis guessed that and probably had the relevant reconnaissance data. They deceived the troopers by launching pistol lights from all the sides. Matvey Lichterman recollects, I ran across 2 troopers from other planes. We looked at each other, waiting for the pistol light signals. Half an hour passed. 3 lights appeared in the sky. In a minute, 3 similar lights to the left from us. Then to the right. In 5 minutes, lights of the same set of colors flew into the sky from all the sides, and it was important to understand who launched them and where the place of gathering was. Transport planes returned to the aerodromes for the second wave of troopers. It turned out that the number of fuel trucks was not calculated properly, and the planes took off not together, but when they were ready. During the night, 298 flying missions were carried out instead of 500 planned, and 4,575 persons and 660 containers with ammunition were dropped. Matvey Lichterman recollects, several other troopers who had miraculously survived during the night had joined us. Everywhere around us there were white spots of parachutes, and in an hour, a total raid began. In the morning, the area was combed out by the Nazi units. Using trained dogs, they looked for the wounded and surviving troopers. The Nazis looked for Soviet troopers, even using aircraft. Petr Nezhavenko recollects, in the morning we saw a small aeroplane, a crutch, flying and looking for parachutes, small units, and aiming the mobile Nazi units to destroy. A bit later, a vehicle arrived with about 15 Nazis. They left it and began to walk in the brushes. They headed towards us, talking, thinking that there was nobody there. There were 6 of us. We hid, distributed aims, let them approach up to 20 meters. I commanded, fire. We shot each one of them with submachine guns. We picked up guns, documents, and ran away. The commanders had no information about the troopers' fate. Due to the incorrect distribution of communication means and radio operators by plane, by the morning of September 25th, there was no communication with the troopers dropped. It became clear that the Dnieper airborne operation was a complete failure. The troopers would not be able to complete their principal mission, to capture the military line to the west and northwest of Veliki Bukrin, and not to allow the enemy to the beachheads occupied by the Soviet troops at the Bukrin curve of the Dnieper. Because of this situation, it was decided to stop the operation. The surviving troopers, without communication, remained face-to-face with the enemy. Matvey Lichterman recollects. At first there were 3 of us. Then a group of 12 troopers formed. For 3 days ahead, we were winning through the squeezing circle of pursuers. But it happened that we were squeezed at a strip. Only 4 escaped via ravines. We ran across the group of Major Zhernosikov, the battalion commander, around 70 persons. In a day, the Nazis besieged us from all the sides. We won through once again, but the group had 14 persons. None of the dispersed airborne groups managed to establish communication with the front headquarters. On the night of September 28th, 3 groups of troopers with radio sets were dropped, but their fate remained unknown. Most probably, they died. Those who managed to escape the chasers, gathered in large groups, began to cooperate with partisans. Grigory Chukrai recollects. We arrested a man in the policeman's uniform. He said that he was a partisan from Ilya Morozenko's group. A meeting with an unknown person in the enemy's territory is an event requiring extreme caution from the commander. I was lucky. If I had been mistaken, I would not be telling this now. I trusted Vasil. We found out from him that the villages nearest to us were Glinicha, Pishinichiniki, and Buchak. He told us as well that Lieutenant Zadelnik's group was in the forest not far from us. We merged with that group and began to act jointly. The groups of Major Alexander Blufstein and First Lieutenant Sheren Petrosian were among the strongest. On October 5th, several large groups of troopers concentrated near Kanev. In total, there were about 1,200 persons. Lieutenant Colonel Sidorchuk, the commander of the 5th Guards Airborne Brigade, headed them and formed one brigade. The troopers launched active subversion operations. They raided the enemy's garrisons, vehicles, blew up bridges. The Nazis withdrew field units from the front and sent them to fight the troopers, but they did not manage to surround and destroy them. Although the offensive of the Soviet troops from the Bukrin beachhead was unsuccessful, significant forces of the Wehrmacht diverted there. As a result, the Red Army had a chance to secretly move the 3rd Guards tank army to the north of Kiev and to inflict a severe blow from the Lyotezh beachhead. On the night of October 26th, the 3rd Guards tank army of General Rybalko crossed to the left bank of the Dnieper from the Bukrin beachhead intact. To conceal the departure of the tank army and artillery to the north from the enemy, the remaining troops made and placed numerous dummies of tanks and artillery. It was done so masterfully that the enemy's aviation and artillery attacked those dummies diligently until the Soviet troops began an offensive to the north of Kiev. Having arrived at the left bank, the tankers marched secretly and quietly to the distance of around 200 kilometers. The tanks went at full drive with their lights off. In the night silence, the roar of the column engines was so deafening that it seemed that the enemy would inevitably learn about the maneuver. But that did not happen. Soon, the 3rd Guards tank army crossed the Desna and the Dnieper again to the beachhead near the town of Lyutezh, to the north of Kiev. The offensive from the Lyutezh beachhead began on November 3rd. Before dawn, General Rybalko's tanks attacked with their lights on and buzzers howling. With that strong psychological attack, the enemy retreated. Having broken down the enemy's defense, the Soviet troops liberated the city of Kiev on November 6th. The bell towers of the Kiev Kavlora welcomed the liberators with chime, and Moscow celebrated the liberation of the Ukrainian capital with a cannon salute. Only in 8 days, the soldiers of the 5th Airborne Brigade joined the troops which had crossed the Dnieper. Many of the troopers were awarded with orders and medals, and Alexander Blushtin and Surn Petrosyan were honored with the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union. Yuri Kordyakin recollects, "In general, I had bad luck with awards. In 1945, I saved my platoon commander who was drowning while crossing the river. An award used to be given for saving a commander, but I never received it. Of course, I have the Red Star Order, the Gallantry Medal, but awards are not many. To tell the truth, a soldier was not meant to receive many." The Red Star Order was instituted in 1930. The military men and law enforcement officers, as well as military units, military ships, enterprises, and organizations were awarded with it. It was awarded for great services in the defense of the USSR during the war and the peacetime, for ensuring state security. The first rank Army commander, later Marshal of the Soviet Union, Vasily Konstantinovich Blyuker, became the first holder of the Red Star Order, the decoration for the operation of repelling the Chinese aggression at the Chinese Eastern Railway carried out successfully a year before took place in May 1930. During the Great Patriotic War, over 2,860,000 persons were awarded the Red Star Order. 6 Red Star Orders decorated to the chest of Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Vasilievich Silientiev. Having distinguished himself during the Orlov operation, the lieutenant received his first order in August 1943. He saved a wounded tanker from a knocked-out T-34 and later brought a T-4 German tank to the disposition of the Soviet troops. Silientiev received the 4th star in May 1945. Upon the war, the authority of the order decreased a bit because it was awarded to the military for length of service. The cancellation of the resolution in 1958 raised the prestige of the award anew. The last decoration with the order took place on 19 December 1991. According to the archive data, during the battles in the enemy's rear, troopers, together with partisans, killed over 3,000 Nazis, blew up the railway bed at 19 locations, derailed 15 trains, destroyed 52 tanks, 6 self-propelled guns, 18 tractors, 227 various vehicles, and a lot of other machinery. The troops approached the border of the USSR. Troopers went forward as well. Although they had to fight as regular infantry in most cases, they did not take off the blue caps, remaining the airborne guards of their motherland.